Well, good morning. My name is Jackie Anderson, and I'm an Assistant Dean at the University of St. Thomas. And it's my pleasure to welcome you to our weekly summer online learning series. I hope everyone had a great 4th of July. Thanks for joining us today. Our session is Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion with University of St. Thomas Management Professor Ernie Owens. Ernie has just recently been appointed as Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Fellow here at the university and is an important voice in creating change in our community. But before I introduce Ernie, let me give you a chance to mark your calendar for our upcoming sessions. Next week, on Tuesday, July 14th, we're being joined by Dr. Marcia Ballinger, and her session is titled 9 Networking Mistakes and How to Avoid Them. Whether you are voluntarily or involuntarily looking for a new role, networking is key. And Marcia spent over 25 years as an executive search recruiter here in the Twin Cities. And these experiences have allowed her to write several books, one of them titled The 20-Minute Networking Meeting. Should be a great session. Then the following week, on Wednesday, July 22nd, we are joined by registered dietitian Christina Myers-Jacks with a session titled Your Immune System Game Plan, Key Strategies for Top Performance. Originally, she had titled it A Love Letter to Your Immune System because this session focuses on the latest science and how to optimize your performance by staying healthy. So I hope participating in this weekly event this summer has provided you with some great professional development. And if you're looking for more comprehensive development, especially during these dog days of summer, we are actually offering a 15% discount on all our courses in July and August. So if you haven't visited our website recently, take a look, check it out. This might be the perfect time to develop some new skills. So with that, let's get on to the logistics and our plan for today. In a moment, I will introduce Ernie Owens, and he'll spend about 45 minutes on the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Now, please feel free to use the chat feature to ask questions at any time during the presentation. And at the end of the session, we'll go through as many questions as we can. And when you address the questions, please address it to all panelists. Now, our goal, as usual, is to end by 8:50 or 8:55, so you can have a break before your 9 o'clock meeting. And if you have any difficulties or need to step away, please know we're recording this whole session and the link will be sent out within a few days. So with that, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ernie Owens. Ernie is a University of St. Thomas Management Professor in the Opus College of Business. Ernie has led the development of pivotal business curriculum, including the design and delivery of the Certified Professional Project Management Certification, CPPM. And I know we have quite a few CPPMers registered for today's session. Ernie is the 2020 Diversity and Inclusion Award winner at the University of St. Thomas and was a recipient of a Distinguished Service Award at the Opus College of Business. And like I said earlier, he has just assumed a pivotal role as a Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Fellow here at the university. Prior to his time in academia, Ernie had a distinguished career in industry, working in executive roles at Unisys, IBM, Mass General Hospital, to name a few. Always an engaging speaker, I can promise you a great session. It is my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Dr. Ernie Owens.
Thank you, Jackie. I appreciate that introduction. And hopefully I live up to the expectations of the words you just shared with everybody, but we'll go forward with that particular process. Yes, I am engaged with diversity, equity, and inclusion here at St. Thomas, and it is a new position. And today's discussion, I do want to start us off with the idea that this is more of an exploration, not so much as a finished product, but a way of getting into the conversation and sharing with you some of my thoughts around DEI and how DEI has come into bearing in terms of my curriculum design and in terms of how I see and how to walk through the space of what's going on currently in 2020. And we all know that this is a year that's taxing for many of us, but the process here is to engage you in some questions and engage you in a conversation. I will be looking around and occasionally have multiple monitors, so I just want to let you know that I'm not looking away, but I have different monitors I'm looking at, and as I get into things, if I have a glitch or two, I will explain to you what's going on in the process. The discussion here that I want to have with you starting out is about behaviors. And in my mind, behaviors are more important than just a word of values. Values are something that we espouse, that we have, but behaviors are an observation of those. And it's very important that people start looking for how people behave and what they do, not just in what they say. So I got a couple of questions here, like think about as we go through this presentation and talk about things. And more so for you to have this as you're going through and frame your questions. And again, any other questions you have, put them out on the chat site and we'll look at them at the end of the conversation. The first one I have is, what do you do to increase inclusion in your life? The key concept here again is, are you bringing people of difference into your existence? Are you bringing people from different spaces into your existence? It is so easy to stay with people who are like you, have an affinity with you, but are you really engaging in opening yourself up and bringing more people to the table? We'll talk more about this as we get into the discussion. And what does your social media site look like? I'm always amazed at how many people will tell me that they are very much engaged with doing in diversity or inclusion. And then I ask them to show me the Facebook or their Instagram sites, and I look at it and there's nobody there besides people of their own orientation or background. And so that tells me, yes, you say you're into inclusion, but your behaviors are not such. You hear the phrase a lot, are you an anti-racist? And I understand what that's getting at. But in thoughts recently, I'm engaged in some conversations, and the real word in my mind is, are you an anti-bigot? And I think bigotry is much bigger than racism, because our racism is one of the factors we're looking at. There's LGBTQ, there's gender, there's orientation, there is age, there's ableism, there's religion. There are other things that we can ask the question, are you pro bringing people in from these other parts of your life? And so are you an anti-bigot? Are you working against bigotry? And what do you do to increase diversity in your life? Again, do you go out into those different spaces, those different areas? Are you engaged with people from different walks of life, different areas? And I find myself, being a man of color, I've had to push myself into places that I never thought I'd be engaged with. You just happened to see a minute ago, one of mine is a motorcycle community, which is something that I've gotten into recently. But as you go into these different communities, are you diversifying yourself professionally, socially, spiritually? And do you find that you use the one exception to the fact of prop up your privilege? My friends are Black. I voted for Obama, and I'll have a chart at the end that kind of looks, and it says, you know what, I've done this one thing, so therefore I'm not into this area of privilege. And maybe you are. And so as you think about those, hold those questions in mind as we go through some of the charts here today. So I want to talk about culture. And culture in many ways is this larger set of values and intangible aspects of our lives and how we do things. And it's our belief systems, the language we use, how we communicate. It's the idea of how you practice things, how do you share things. And so what activities do you do? What activities do you like? And what, again, I just share with you, I go into a community of sports and motorcycling where I walk around and there's almost nobody but myself as a person of color. And so I'm realizing that there's people who see themselves as having a wonderful time and a nice time are really pretty much isolated themselves into their own bubbles. And I can see that going through many different communities as I walk through and see myself as usually the one. How we earn a living. Do we understand that earning a living gives people the sense of control of their lives, ability to control their existence and how they can do things? And when you do and you earn a living, is that space diverse? Is that space a place where there's inclusion? Or is it, again, a community of people much like yourself? And what's going on inside that enterprise that allows it to feel comfortable with that lack of diversity? Why do we socialize? Who do we socialize with? Again, who do you hang out with? And do a little inventory in yourself, just for a week or so. Just track down who you're hanging out with. And who do you affinity with? The people you feel most connected with and connected to. Who are those people? And interesting enough, who do you let govern you? Who are the people that you sense that they have authority to give you direction? And again, we think of police, we think of city officials, we think of administrators. If they're people of difference, people of color, people who are non-majority, are you as comfortable with that governance as you are with people who are the majority? And how are we represented? The idea, again, when you go into different places in terms of representation, are there people who are sitting in decision-making roles that represent other sectors, other groups, other people? Or are they pretty much, again, much looking like yourself? And I want to make sure when I use that word looking like yourself that we don't always think this is just a black on white thing, because I'm going to get to the chart later on that addresses that. And who do you break bread with? Who are you hanging out with and sharing your meals and things with? And how do you feel safe in travel? I found myself going to France several times to teach classes, and I had realized that I was not being very diverse. And what I mean by that, I did not learn the language very well. And so when I was traveling, I got into a situation where I did not know where I was going. I was in a space I had no sense of what was going on. And because I hadn't made myself proficient in French, I did not know what to do. And ironically, what was interesting is a number of students on the train sensed my trouble. And they broke into pure English, I mean, beautiful English, and asked me what was I trying to do. And it was like 4 or 5 at first, and it was about 7 or 8. And after they got me safe, they all went back to French. And I realized that they were inclusive in my world, but I was not diverse in theirs. And so this whole concept, again, is how are you as you go through the world and as you travel? Are you making yourself in a situation where you are inclusive and also being diverse? So let me talk about a community I am a member of, the African American community. And I've had the luxury of going and looking at my ancestry. And as you can see here, the 1690 Project talks about the concept of the first slaves to America, which are not the first slaves, by the way. 1501 in Hispaniola is where we start seeing the slave trade develop. But when I did my ancestry, I found out was interesting that I am from Mali and I'm from Nigeria, primarily Nigerian. And so this whole concept of the engagement of slavery, this ability to take people and make them less, happened, and it was really inculcated in us in 1619. Well, we move ourselves into a situation of emancipation in 1863, but you've heard just recently this whole issue of Juneteenth, 1865, when the last group of African American slaves were realized that they were freed and they were given their freedom. Now, just the fact that I'm using the word given their freedom itself is repulsive to me. But it's a simple reality of what's happening in our nation. There's a perception that somebody gave me and my ancestors the right to exist. Well, it goes even worse when you get to Tulsa in 1921, when you had a very thriving, very robust African American community that was taking care of itself and was very self-sufficient and engaging, and it was burnt to the ground by folks who believed that my ancestors, people who look like myself, should not have those abilities, should not have those means. And they burnt that to the ground. And we wonder to this day why many cultures, particularly cultures of color, don't have robust systems. Well, those systems were started, but they were destroyed. And in 1948, the idea of armed services, and I bring this up because my father was a military man, and it was fascinating for me to watch him and take his pride in being a steward, but only to learn later on he could not be anything else but a steward in the armed services. Because our government said, because of his skin color, that 2 millimeters of difference between you and most of us at this point, said he could not go beyond that stage. And then Brown versus Board of Education, allowing people to become educated in this society and engaging us and allowing people to come to the classroom. Well, again, that was the beginning of a discussion. And we have Emmett Till and Rosa Parks, both who were in different parts of moving forward the civil rights movement. And then Martin Luther King in Atlanta in a march on Selma. And the whole idea, again, is what happened in Atlanta, and how we come to understand this. But then we had the boycott, where young men sat at the counter just to have a meal, only to be assaulted and to be pushed and basically beaten up in the process. And then Ruby Ridge, who goes to school and has to have guards protect her day in, day out, would not eat food at the school because she was afraid she'd be poisoned. And in 1963, the March on Washington, this is now getting into the area where I recognize this movement because I've been involved with civil rights for almost 50 years now. And I remember this day very well, and that march, plus the church bombing where the young ladies were killed. And again, because of a skin color. In 1964, civil rights, LBJ, much a reluctant participant in this process, much like Abraham Lincoln, both doing what was politically expedient to make this process work. And then you have Malcolm X in the March of Selma, the Voting Rights Act, and the Voting Rights Act itself is still somewhat in question as to how does that act still engage state. Can it be taken away in the process? And we have the assassination of fair housing. But then we advance forward to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and Arbery and the others. And the whole idea that if we look from the 2000s back to 1619, we've got 400 years of trauma, 400 years of a community facing the fact that somebody is telling them that they're not worthy. They're 3/5 of a man. They're not equal in this process. You have communities that have been developing themselves, trying to participate in this process and having those processes taken away from them, those successes. Educational systems and redlining, places that said you can't live in certain places. And yet we get into 2020s and people today are talking about how tired they are of hearing about civil rights, how tired they are of hearing about these deaths, how tired they are of hearing about, yet we've had a 400, as I said, 1501 in Hispaniola, 500-year process of people being frustrated or angry or being denied. And so when people come and say, you know what, when are we going to get over this? I look at them and I question, where are they thinking? What do they not understand about my lineage and my movement into this society? But I do want to make sure we understand that this process in our country is colorized between particularly Black and white, Latinx and white, Asian and white. And it is not just that discussion, because there is something much larger that this is a part of. And it's this concept of hate. It's this concept of majority versus minority. And I want to explore this because I think so often many people here who feel that they are going to feel guilty about getting to this conversation. To understand, this is not a conversation just because of the United States. It's a conversation about mankind and our ability to do things to each other and each other in some very bad ways. And you'll notice the first bullet point here is about religion and how it authorized a lot of this disgust, this hate, this way of treating other people. And it did it in many ways for commerce, for establishing colonies, giving people the right to take over other people's lives so that these people in authority, quote unquote, could utilize that resource, that free resource. By the way, the resource that makes this country great. We have zero down payment on labor for the wealth that we're generating today. And so you look at popes who gave rights to slavery, and it's not just the Catholic Church, it's all the religions that did this, but the key concept again is commerce. And so that leads to what? The genocide that happened in North America. We look at today the indigenous people here in our society and how they're struggling, and the smallpox and the disease that came and wiped out massive amounts of the people that were here. Yet at the same time, the people who came over here who themselves were oppressed did a lot of that oppression and took over the United North America. That followed by South America rapidly. As I said earlier, slaves arrived in Hispaniola in 1501. And this is the beginning as what we tend to call the slave trade. Unfortunately, slave trade has been going on for a long period before that. We talk about 1690 and the arrival of the slaves here in this country. But you also have 1870, we have the genocide in Australia. The 1880s, the colonization of Africa and its genocide. The 1940 Holocaust and its genocide. And we have things like the 1942 internment of the Japanese. And we also have what's something interesting that's been going on for a long period of time, and many of us may not know about. It's called the Barakaru in Japan. It's a genocide. It's an interesting genocide because it brings up the fact that these are the same people who are killing each other. And the key about the Barakaru is they were people who followed the samurai. And when the samurai were out of favor, these people did unit the tanning industry, and they tanned leather. And they were considered second-class citizens even to today, 2020. Many of them cannot marry, quote unquote, other Japanese. You and I look at them and say, I don't understand the difference, but it's their history. And these people have a huge suicide rate. We have the Khmer Rouge, who also created genocide. And so this is, again, people who are of the same cultural, ethnic background doing cleansing. And we see it in Rwanda with the Hutus and Tutsis. And so this conversation about this majority minority discussion should not be only perceived as that as an American issue. It's a humanity issue. And therefore, it's one of those ones where I have people let go of this idea that somehow that this is just about us. This is about people and how people tend to, when they get authority, to get power, to get privilege, they tend to ignore those who are not in privilege. They sometimes tend to act horribly to those who are out of privilege. And so how do you manage this? What do you do in the process of dealing with these kinds of things? Well, one of the things that's going on right now in our society is this larger concept of shifts. And what's happening as we move forward? We see that basically some interesting things are happening. And I was fascinated to read the work of Peter Drucker's Management 21st Century. And Drucker talks about the concept of how women are changing and changing their authority. Now, Drucker wrote this book a while back. And the whole concept here again is that we see a shift in wealth. But if you marry Drucker's book with a book called The Millionaire Next Door, and it raises the question, what do we see happening that's making this shift, which comes from the work of Peter Schwartz, The Art of the Long View. And he talks about this concept, this idea of, can you see these shifts, these changes happen in society? Well, the argument is there are things going on that many of us don't recognize, and there is a shift underfoot in the change of women now becoming more engaged in our schools and more engaged in our leadership roles. Now, please don't misunderstand me. We still have right now sort of a massive disparity between women and men, but we do have a shift happening. And one of those shifts is that goes to Drucker's concept of there's going to be a massive wealth redistribution. And that massive wealth distribution is not coming from the idea that we should do the right thing, but something biological is happening. Well, if we look at who the dominant wealth group in this society is, we discover it is white men, older white men of means. Well, what's fascinating about that is if you go to the work, again, looking at how women and men who are married are shifting wealth, we find that most of those women who are married to these older white men, and men are next door, most of these older white men are still married to the original wives. In fact, many of them still live in their original homes. They're very frugal people, and there's going to be a wealth distribution happening right about now. So we're seeing a shift in wealth happening in our society that's going towards women. But we also see a shift in women taking on educated work, going into the workforce and doing managerial type structures and getting into the positions of entrepreneurship. So we're going to see this shift, this driving force that Peter Schwartz talks about, this driving us, which many of us are not seeing. But we're also seeing this driving force happening with people of color. We have an interesting shift happening. And most of us know about the idea of majority minority, that the people of color in this nation will be a majority group as a collective group. But a better way of saying this, there'll be no majority group. All groups will be in a minority status. And it looks at based on the data, about 2039 is when we'll see this happen in the workplace. Well, remember, this is 2020. So we're not talking a long time from now. We're actually talking one generation. So those millennials out there, their children and their grandchildren will see a non-majority world, and that's transitioning as we see. And Leslie calls it punctuated equilibrium. Things go along for a certain while to a certain state, and then you hit a step function and a change. Well, part of the step function we're seeing right now was things like the George Floyd incident, the issues that's happening with Black Lives Matters, things that are happening with people trying to establish themselves and engage in a process and changing this narrative that we have all voices involved. And so, yes, we still have tensions. I was watching the video, and I'm sure some of you saw it the other day, of the young man who was in Iowa who was being assaulted, and people are trying to lynch him in broad daylight. And the thing that changed it was the thing that many of you need to think about as allies: your camera. Keep your cameras ready. Keep them ready to be open up and take a look at things and capture things. Because that's a step, that's a change that's happening to put people aware what's going on in this process. But we also have international change happening. And this is one of the ones that I found fascinating, because I myself was not so aware of the fact that I knew that the United States was going to grow in size. We're about 4% of the world's population. We're going to continue to grow, as China and India and other places will not grow as rapidly as we will grow. But they will still be bigger than us in total size. But what's fascinating in this discussion, as you do some research, you'll discover that Africa, which is on the ascent, will be about 40% of the world's population by 2100. And in particular, one nation state, Nigeria, which is about 1/2 of what we were, will be twice the size of the United States. And again, goes back to this concept of how they do a family. And so we see again a shift that's happening on the international basis. And there's other parts of the world that are making these changes and growing. You'll see changes in Brazil and other places where, again, the non-majority culture will be becoming part of a minority status. And as you look around the world, you're seeing that the European ancestry is diminishing for an interesting piece. And this is going to go back to Peter Drucker again. Women who have wealth have fewer children, because women who have most of the wealth in this world are those of in the white community. They're having fewer children. Why? Because they have other things they want to do with their lives. Now, before we make this just that it's only white women having fewer children, Peter Drucker makes it very clear: women of wealth have fewer children. And so as we see more people coming into wealth, those populations, so we're going to see a dynamic shift continuing as we go forward in time. As those populations who become wealthy will have less children, so we'll see changes. And so this dominance will change us. This concept of engagement around the world will change us in terms of who is in power, who is in authority, and who will have positions. Gender orientation is changing on us. We see the idea that same-sex marriages and binary and people who have other orientations to their partnership are growing and are getting recognized. And we're recognizing those relationships and validating those activities. So what are we seeing? We're seeing a shift in the social structure. It's no longer just this nuclear family thing. It's not just this traditional Ozzie and Harriet construct, but that something is changing underfoot, and it's causing us to look different, to behave different. And for us in industry, we've got to be mindful that this difference is the customer base. It is a shift. And it's interesting that this shift is happening because it's changing enterprises to behave. Look what is happening with the NFL. The whole idea again of all of a sudden we see Colin Kaepernick is now valued. Yet you go back a few years ago and that was not the case. And it's not, and I would love to believe that this was solely on the fact that people believed in values. And I always go back to behaviors. I see the idea that enterprises behave because of their bottom lines. They behave because of what people are doing. Now, it is also true that there are some very good people going into leadership roles in our corporations who are seeing the morality and want their behaviors to demonstrate that their enterprises reflect those values in good ways. So that is happening as well. I don't want to short shrift that, but I do also want to understand that this concept of change is in many ways driven by the fact that we see a demographic shift. We see something, and I would be fascinating if we somehow could have run a corollary or complementary project where we had the society continuing to be just majority of people European ancestry. What that would look like, would we be shifting? And my senses are no, but I do think we're seeing that there's a shift. So again, business, the food we eat every day. You and I, many of us, those of us who like to call ourselves foodies, we like to go into places and be in different places. We like to blend up things and mash up different activities and different cultures and different places. And we also have music, which is, again, sort of blending. And we have the different entertainment venues, or people are going to places and they're engaging, particularly my millennial and Gen Z colleagues. You see a lot of that, and it is normal. Though I would argue in my boomer cohort that I'm a member of, that is not normal. And so there is this shift. Again, if you look for places where innovation and disruption and change is happening, you see it in your New York, your Dubai, your London, your Singapore, Lagos, and Sangdu. And these are places where you see now around the world where countries are putting together international cities. If you haven't looked at Sangdu or Lagos, do some research. You're going to find out something fascinating. It's much like Dubai, where you have the Dutch coming in and creating spaces where people are coming in and they're being international players in this process. And these places are becoming economic powerhouses because of this diversity. It's not just good enough to feel good. Again, diversity leads to more creative teams and increased companies' bottom lines. Well, let's stop there for a second and ask the question, why is diversity creating the bottom line? Well, we just said a minute ago, we have a shift in demographics. And so if you're going to anticipate, you're going to get people like myself, like my children, engage in something, you've got to welcome them into the market space. You've got to welcome them into the place of which they want to participate and where they want to consume. And so businesses are recognizing that this is changing the bottom line. McKinsey is ranking in the top quartile executive board, saying 35% like to outperform industry mediums because they are more diverse. Yet the last two sentences here still are cautionary tales. We tend to promote people who we feel comfortable with, and often that is people who are like us. And this is why we see the next sentence, as 72% of CEOs in the top Fortune 500 are still white males. We tend to still work off of affinity. And what needs to change is this concept of affinity. It can't be affinity based on race. It needs to be more affinity based on entrepreneurship, market presence, sense of the vision and mission of the enterprise where you're trying to go and satisfy the customer's needs and wants. And in that sense of affinity, you'll see a great diversity of new players coming to the table. But we still are challenging, we're still being challenged by that narrative today and that process. And so how do we engage people to look at this and then change? And so the irony is that we started out with slavery. We started out with this whole concept of bringing people from faith traditions into this idea of being less than the other because it would help the markets. Again, $0 cost down on labor to develop these things. We would not be the great nation we are, quote unquote, had we not had slavery. I don't think the idea that not paying people and making people sweat and die so somebody could have their margins would be different for us had we paid for that labor. We'd be struggling more so. But that same commerce construct is interesting enough becoming a vehicle for changing us back to where we should be. Because you can't get margins. You can't produce a product. You can't be successful if you only sell it to a smaller and smaller base. And so this concept again is that diversity is being driven by the market narrative, but it's also being driven by a social narrative, a social justice narrative. people who believe in good behavior, people who want a good society. And as those two mesh up and continue to become partners in this narrative, we'll see the change that many of us would like to see in this nation, and an engagement in this nation as we go forward. So the concept of question comes into place is this concept of allyship. How do you participate in this discussion? And it is not uncommon for me to deal with many of my quote unquote white friends who the question will be, they'll say phrases, they'll use language, and they don't sometimes recognize they're saying things that are harmful. Like, you speak well, Ernie. You know what? When you do things, you engage, you're very comfortable with white people. Those are phrases that just don't settle well with people who are of community of color. And the idea of trying to justify things like black on black crime. These are statements that are telling me that you're not listening, that you're not recognizing, you're not exploring what you're trying to do. You're not willing to recognize that this structured system has privilege in it. And if you're of the European ancestry, and which is interesting in itself, because many of the communities that were part of the European communities were discriminated against by themselves. The Irish and the Germans and the Italians were pushed in many ways not to be participant, yet today it's no longer considered Irish and German, it's considered white. So the privilege in that, and not recognizing the privilege and understanding how to bring other people involved in the process creates an interesting problem. You got to recognize the privilege that you have. Nobody said you're a bad person, but you have privilege. You need to educate yourself. And the next slide I have will talk about some of the things you can do to do just that. Figure out what's going on. Be honest. Listen and show integrity. Integrity is the idea of talking about something, acting upon it, looking for the moral rationale within it, and then expounding upon it, which means acting, doing something about this process. Have difficult conversations. I am always impressed when somebody tries to have a conversation, and I believe that race, gender orientation, ableism, other things that happen about putting people away from the majority, having that conversation and attempting it, no matter how messy it is better than sitting there and trying not to offend. You'll learn language, you'll learn things, you'll feel comfortable with something as you engage in the conversation, no matter how difficult it is. And an honest person trying to engage will find themselves being met most likely with an honest response. But trying to be safe is not the thing to do. Trying not to engage is not the thing to do. You have to learn to develop your own language. Get active and engage personally. Do things. Get out in the community, in places where you're not comfortable, and engage. If you've got a moral compass, if you believe that there should be a better place or a better society, get out and get involved. Work with organizations for change. There are structured systems out there. There are communities out here. There are procedures out there, mechanisms that you can get out and do and not necessarily develop a new approach. Go to those existing organizations and get involved. And live in a multicultural existence. If everybody around you looks like you most of the time, you're not in a multicultural existence. And multicultural, again, is not just race. Again, it can be about orientation. It can be about studying science. It can be studying sports. It can be building, using your hands. It could be art. Get in other places. And as I said earlier, be an anti-bigot. Stop trying to be safe. Get out there and help others who are not included in the process, to be part of the process, to be engaged in the process, and to share what's going on as you go forward. So some of the resources you can look at. This will come to you as part of the process, and so you can be able to click on these and go to them. The top one is a real nice compendium of sources on how to deal with things, particularly in relevance to Black lives. But there are other sources out there that allow you to find books and materials and things that help you inform yourself about what's going on. And do inform yourself. Spend some time as if you were doing any other thing that you may be engaging with for the first time or want to become excellent at. Spend time developing yourself in the process. Some of the books we use here at St. Thomas, we use How to Be an Anti-Racist by Kendi and White Fragility by D'Angelo. And some of you may have seen this recently in the news. My Body is a Confederate Monument by Carolyn Williams. And it really raises the question about what does a Confederacy stand for? And there are many other books and things out there for you to look at. Get involved and start reading and start engaging, and then start having conversations with people. Doesn't have to be somebody of color, but engage with people and find out how you're feeling about these issues. An excellent podcast, the 1690 Project. It will again take you into the idea how we stepped into this racial divide with the African American community and the majority community. And there's a video here called The Look. If you haven't seen it, it's a fascinating piece where it will give you it's a 2-minute video that will give you an idea how people like myself walk into the world, how we see, and how we get the look from people. To this day, I can't shake how I had pulled off the road by a cop. And I had my family in the car. And the officer comes up and says, license and registration. And I said, what did I do, officer? He says, there was a robbery in the neighborhood. And I looked at him and said, well, why are you stopping me? He said, it was a black man. And I said, and? He says, no, I need to see a license and registration. Now, I could have sat back and fought my rights. But then again, we've seen how that has not worked out real well for people like Philando Castile. And so I basically gave up my license and everything. And then after the end, he came back and said, you can go. And I said, could you describe for me the black man? Well, he was a tall, light-skinned person. Well, if you know anything about me, I am not tall and I am not light-skinned. I'm extremely dark-skinned and very proud of it. But the simple fact is that this particular person chose to look at me as if I need to be the other. Never bothered to ask anything about who I am, my background, just made that assumption about the 2 millimeters of skin and that I was a likely suspect. Now, you can imagine how I had to have a conversation with my children with that afterwards, in that process, and the fear that they had, that officer to this day will never understand. And if you want a very good discussion about trauma in the Black community, look at the Call to Mind, this spotlight on Black trauma policy that was conducted by Angela Davis. And she did this about a month or so ago. It was phenomenal because it will give you the real feel of how people like myself see this particular process, how we engage in our given day. Last but not least, before I turn this over and turn it back to my colleagues, is this concept of what might you do differently. And this is Naval Intuition's Congress model, which I find is a very good tool to help you stop and assess what you're doing and what would you like to do. But before I go there, there's another piece called Neil Ferguson's Networld. I'd encourage you to also to get a hold of that video that is on PBS. And it talks about the system and the system, how people tend to naturally go into affinity. And it's a scientific tool. It gives you the idea of how people will coalesce into ways of being without even thinking about it. It's just a natural phenomenon. And we've got to work hard to not let that happen. But one of the ways to do that is to ask yourself the question, who are you? And in this process here, what I would encourage you to do is ask what's coming into your life, your inputs that give you a sense of what you see and how you engage in diverse worlds. And how do you look at diversity, equity, inclusion as a strategic tool or an asset? What is the work you do around this currently today? In the informal ways and formal ways you do this, and the people you engage with? And what have been the outcomes of your relationships with people in diverse situations and in inclusion situations? Now, this all over here is about how you're actually doing it right now. Not what you want it to be, because that's what this is. Once you've sat down and framed what your process of inclusion is, your process of diversity, your process of looking at equity, how you're doing it right now, and be honest with yourself, then come back and frame the idea, how would you like it to be? What does your desired state look like? Now, the beauty of this particular model is once you frame this, you can always go back and ask, what do you have to change in formal structures and, informal structures, formal structures, in relationships, in work, and desires and inputs that you have to get to that new state. And this becomes a model of change. This is a way that you can change yourself to be somebody who frames and works and engages in this process to become better, a better participant, a better ally, a better person in helping yourself and this nation state become a better place for inclusion. I'm going to turn it back over to my colleagues here and see if there are any questions or comments or thoughts on this. And again, remember, mistakes can be made in the conversation. If I made some, I'll live with them, because the conversation is not perfect. It's about to have the dialogue and to engage with each other. So I turn this back over.
Ernie, that was great, and clearly provided a lot of thought starters, because I have quite a few questions for you. We'll try to get through as many as we can and still honor our end time. So if you're game, here they come.
Okay.
The first one is, do you expect the current push for change will continue its momentum? It seems like this is another pivotal moment in history.
The answer to that in my mind is yes, it will continue its momentum. And the whole idea is that, as I said earlier about Lester Thoreau's concept of punctuated equilibrium, we've hit a step function. We've made a change. And in that change, we have a couple of things working for us. One, a demographics in millennials and in Gen Z that just does not tolerate this. This is just not the world they want to live in. I'm going to say it in a more interesting way. My cohort, boomers, are going away. And they know that they have some issues. And so there's a shift in that process. But you also see what happened in the market. The market is changing because it's recognizing its base is changing. So there's some very pragmatic reasons why it's changing, and there's some thought leaders of why it's changing. There's some societal reasons why it's changing, and there's some faith community leaders who are driving this change. I keep thinking of Bishop Barber and people of that nature who are pushing us forward. So I do think this is not going to fall back, as I've seen in my last 5-6 decades of existence, where we have started something and then we fall back. I do think this is going to continue. This does feel different.
All right, thank you. And to the next question. How do you recommend we make amends for ignorance in the past? Do we reopen wounds or move forward armed with more insight, committed to do better, and learn from our mistakes?
You never dismiss the past, you learn from it. It's a tool that gives you an idea of what happened. It's a foundational piece by which you make change. But you move forward and you don't lament. You don't go back and try to settle scores. You move forward with the idea of where do we want to be. You have a vision, you have a mission, you have a sense of the greatness this nation can be, with an understanding of what it has not been or what it has been. We've done some good things, but lamenting or trying to say I'm going to worry about what happened in the past, it's knowledge, but it is not what the action should be for as we go forward.
All right, thank you. I have kind of a cluster of questions that center around the same issue. So I'm going to just give you 3 avenues to take.
Okay.
The first one is, I've seen so many postings for DEI professionals, but not necessarily seeing organizations being overly inclusive or diverse. What is happening? Another take on that goes to, how would one approach an employer about their culture of inclusion or lack of inclusion? And another one in that same kind of bailiwick is affinity based on marketplace. I'm sorry. No, let's stick with those 2.
So we know, as I said earlier, most of the CEOs in this nation are still white males. We still know that most of the entrepreneurs in this nation are white males. Though we see women quickly gaining on that number. And we also see more and more communities of color deciding that's the strategy they want to work with. We're not going to see in the next 2 or 3 years a massive sea change, but we do see the energy of a change. And we do see more and more, if you're paying attention to the news and watching, you're seeing more people of color being promoted into key positions. You're seeing more people of LGBTQ being promoted into position. You're seeing more women being promoted into position. And so it's going to take a little bit of while before you see it in such a way that you can validate it and just by your eyes see it naturally. But it's happening. But if you were to take a score today, as I'd say in the country, look at it today, no, you don't see that. But you do see projections moving in the right direction. And the thing that, again, is going to make that happen is a good people like ourselves moving into the leadership roles will pull on those people and to bring them forward. So that, I believe, is going to happen.
So there's a spin-off of that which talks about what steps should a small privately held company do to diversify its ownership and management team that is currently all white?
It should look at why its team's all white. It should look at how does it pull people that value its product into its discussion, who are not part of the white community. How does it engage in going into schools or universities or hiring organizations that can bring them more resources of diverse nature? Because if it's got an all-white leadership, an all-white enterprise, all-white employment base, it's missing products, it's missing markets, it's missing potential customers and clients. It's got a paradigm issue. And it's not that they're bad people, but they're missing sectors that they don't understand the voice. So they're going to have to put themselves or bring in an agency or hire somebody that can put them into these other spaces, because they will put themselves at a disadvantage as time goes forward. If they're a small company wanting to go large, this is just not going to be successful.
All right, next question. You talk about diversifying social media, your social media. Who are some of your favorite people to follow, and how do we do that?
Oh boy, that's a tough one. I have so many people I follow, but I follow different people. I have students, I've got colleagues, I'm into different social community groups that I follow. I mean, of all places, I go and I do snowmobiling. You want to talk about a 90+% white community. You get out there and so you go out and you put yourself into different places. There's no one person that I follow. I follow communities of people. I do readings on different things. I find different articles. I find different magazines. I go on different podcasts. Put yourself into places where you find people of different voices. And that's the way you'll pull yourself forward into this conversation.
All right, I'm going to try to get one or two more questions in. How do we ensure that the best person for the position gets hired? For instance, professional orchestras do blind auditions, so only the musician's abilities get hired.
And the musician's ability is one thing, but the customer's desire to be in the audience is another thing. And so you can't ignore the fact that your customer base, and by the way, who's listening? So who's making the blind decision? Right there, you have a paradigm problem. You're assuming that it's neutral. You're assuming that it's, we're doing an honest thing. We're doing a sort of but you've got a built-in paradigm problem. And so you have to find ways to bring other voices and other members into this discussion. And I said earlier about the idea of infusion of new sounds and new music and things. And maybe you're going to continue to keep playing the same thing to your customer base, but then your customer base is going to end up shrinking on you.
All right, I'm going to squeeze in one last question. Are you game?
Go for it.
All right, you've discussed the perceptions of boomers and millennials. What about Gen Zs? How do you see their perceptions and behaviors as they were influenced by boomer parents and are now moving into more leadership roles in business?
The interesting thing in the literature is that Gen Z will be more like the traditionalists, which is the generation before boomers. And so this group, I'm noticing some of that in interesting narratives, they're going to be more policy oriented. They're going to be more data driven. They're going to be more allegiance to procedures and process. And so I'm seeing some of that. They're not millennials. I think the mistake for people to think that Gen Z is just another group of millennials. Those are different cohorts on a macro. Now, again, don't go to any one individual person, but on the macro, those are different cohorts. And so Gen Z, I think, is going to be even less tolerant than some of the things that we see happening with separation of different groups. They are very much wanting to have individuals and policies and procedures, and people do things based on their values and capabilities, but they don't want to see this idea of us versus them as much as we've seen in other cohorts. So that's my initial flush on it. We've got 2 or 3 classes of those coming through so far, but yes, I do see a change.
All right, I hate to say it, we're at time, and I'm going to wrap us up. I want to thank you, Ernie, for a provocative presentation, very enjoyable. As promised, we'll be sending out a link to the recorded session next week. We'll also include those links of resources that Ernie had in his presentation deck. And if you enjoyed today's session, Ernie actually is teaching in our Certified Professional Project Manager program next week. Kicks off next Monday, and we have that discount for July and August. You may want to check that out. So with that, we hope to see you next week on Tuesday, July 14th with Dr. Marcia Ballinger, 9 networking mistakes and how to avoid them. Thank you for joining us today. Stay safe, stay well, and I hope you join us next week.